there are two competing approaches to knowledge and how we as human beings acquire knowledge and whether we have any, certain reliable knowledge. One was the approach that we saw taken by Plato that says that, that reason is a better tool for obtaining real knowledge. Remember, knowledge for Plato was about eternal things in the realm of the forms, not things in this world. And the point is, this idea of whether reason gives us a special end to knowledge has been a continuing, ongoing discussion in philosophy, certainly really since before the time of Plato. But Descartes made the theory of knowledge, epistemology, central in his whole philosophy. And he is considered to be the father of modern philosophy because what he did was he said, look, we got to start philosophy all the way over again from scratch. And his reason for doing this is that he thought that too many false notions had crept into philosophy. And so Descartes wanted to rebuild the whole foundations of our knowledge, both philosophical and scientific, on a firm basis. And his model was geometry. Now, Descartes was no slouch when it came to geometry. He was the inventor of analytic geometry. Now, you have to go pretty far in math to take a course in analytic geometry, but basically, it's a way of combining algebra and geometry together, and Descartes invented it. So he's very impressed with the way, if you can think about your plane geometry in high school, if you had to take that. He was impressed with the way that in a system of Euclidean plane geometry, you get reliable knowledge because the whole system is built on a few absolutely true axioms. Statements like things equal to the same things are equal to one another, or the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. And the whole system of truths in plane geometry that you took in high school follows from about 4 or 5 simple statements like that. And so how do I know the theorems and the corollaries to the theorems are true? Well, they're derived either from other theorems or ultimately they are derived from these absolutely true axioms. But then how do I know the axioms are true? Well, the answer is that they're supposed to be self-evidently true. That is, all we have to do is hear a statement like things equal to the same things are equal to one another, or the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, and we immediately say, well, of course they're true. Of course that's true. So what Descartes wanted to do, and the reason we're bringing geometry into this, was set the whole of knowledge in science and philosophy on the same kind of firm foundation. And the way he goes about it is by using skeptical arguments to eliminate from consideration as fundamental principles in a system things that aren't obviously and evidently true. Now, let me say one thing about innate knowledge. Descartes is in the rationalist tradition the tradition that says reason gives us a special end to knowledge that's even better than what the five senses can do. Now, the opposing view is called empiricism, and it says if we have any reliable knowledge, it comes after we're born from observations of our five senses. But for John Locke, the founder of empiricism, or at least one of its principal advocates, when we come into this world, our mind is like that blackboard over there, a clean slate. And if we have any knowledge at all, it's after we're born that we acquire it via our five senses. That's not the story that we got in Plato's Meno, is it? Plato's slave boy had some knowledge at birth about geometry. So why, if he had knowledge of geometry, did Socrates have to question him? Well, Plato's answer is, and Socrates' answer is that at birth we kind of, it's so shocking, and he literally says this, the experience of a soul being reincarnated in a new body is so shocking that this knowledge is knocked into a kind of latent state, and that's why it requires things like questioning to bring it to the surface. But for Socrates, all knowledge is really recollection of stuff our soul knew when it was in the realm of the forms, outside the cave before birth. So why don't we acquire knowledge at birth, says Socrates? Because that's the point where we actually lose it. Now, Descartes is a rationalist, but he is in the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? Now, there may be some borderline Christian sects that countenance reincarnation, but for most of Christianity, they accept the Bible verse that says it is appointed unto man, human beings, once to die, and after that the judgment. That there ain't no recycling through different, bodies. There's no such thing as reincarnation, for Orthodox Christianity. And so you can say, well, if we're not reincarnated, how is it that Descartes is going to claim we have some knowledge at birth? Well, it's basically that when God creates souls, that God puts this knowledge into us at birth. So Socrates says we forget most of what we knew at birth. The Christian rationalists say that's when we get innate knowledge. The word innate, you've seen, in a few months we'll be into the Christian season for people who celebrate Christmas. And you see the word innate in nativity. So innate knowledge is knowledge that we have at birth. The empiricists are going to go on to say we don't have any knowledge at birth. But Descartes says we do, and he wants to set knowledge on this firm foundation. Descartes was independently wealthy most of his life, and so he could stay in bed till noon and think and write philosophy. He wants to set everything aright and totally redo the foundations of philosophy. And so he needs some time and space to do this. So he gets himself by himself in his living room where there's a big old fire going. And in his meditations, he gets alone by himself to think about the foundations of philosophy. So the full title of Descartes' Meditations is Meditations on First Philosophy. First philosophy was considered the part of philosophy that deals with the most fundamental principles of knowledge, the foundations of knowledge. So Descartes wants to get himself alone in a room and examine his beliefs. In other words, he's doing what Plato said the prisoners in the cave ought to do: re-examine what he believes and why he believes it. And Descartes says, well, I've accepted many false beliefs from childhood. Right? You don't want to go on with a head full of false beliefs, right? If there's no tooth fairy, you don't want to go on believing there is one. If there's no big fat man at the North Pole who brings you presents on every December 24th, you don't want to go on believing that that's the case. Now, I'm not trying to rock anybody's world here, right? I told you the 4 stages of life, I think. Didn't I? Yeah, so at any rate, and so he says, if my most fundamental beliefs are false, then other beliefs that derive from them are also false. So he says, I gotta do a kind of destructive program. So he's going to do what Plato says we ought to do, examine our fundamental beliefs. So establishing a lasting basis for science and philosophy for Descartes requires that he demolish his current belief edifice and that he start all over again from new foundations. So in other words, this may seem to you a sort of backwards program, but he's trying to find, Descartes is not trying to end up a skeptic. He's trying to find absolute foundational principles for certain knowledge in philosophy and the sciences. But the way he goes about it, the way he goes about destroying his current belief edifice, is by using a number of skeptical arguments that called into question the certainty of many of the beliefs he already had. So he's trying to sort through his beliefs. Now, to demolish his current beliefs, it's unnecessary and, from a practical standpoint, impossible for him to prove them all false. Right? In other words, he's saying, I don't have to actually prove them all false to set them on the side for now. He says it's going to be sufficient for me to just raise a doubt about them. If you assent to something, you agree that it's true, right? So if you withhold assent, you're saying, look, I'm in doubt about this claim, so I'm not going to pronounce it true or false, and I'm certainly not going to call it true. So he's going to withhold assent from any beliefs that he finds that aren't completely certain or beyond doubt. And these, even though he has not proved them false, he's going to set them on the side for right now because they're not the absolutely certain first principles of knowledge that he's looking for. And so, now also, not only does he not need to prove everything false, he doesn't need to go through each individual belief, right? I mean, how many beliefs, separate beliefs, do you have? Is it even something you can count, right? I mean, this would be an undoable program if he had to go through every separate belief he had. But he says, when he says he need only look at the most basic principles on which they rest, basically he's talking about principles that order beliefs into different classes and categories. In other words, what he's going to do is raise doubts about whole groups or classes of beliefs. And so he says, should these principles that define a class of beliefs be doubtful, any beliefs resting on them, any beliefs in that class will also be doubtful. So he says, what's the first principle that defines a class of beliefs? Well, Plato, as we saw, denigrated knowledge by the senses. That's what we get inside the cave in this world. He wants knowledge by reason. So it's not surprising that Descartes, in the same tradition, takes aim first at knowledge we have by our five senses. So he says, here's a principle we might consider adopting, that many beliefs based on sense experience are so certain that they're beyond doubt. And he says some beliefs derived from the senses are doubtful. In other words, Descartes knows that beliefs about maybe very small objects or very distant objects. Suppose you're walking on a beach in the morning and it's a little foggy, and you see something up ahead of you in the distance, and you say, well, there's a seagull. And then you get closer and closer, and you wonder, well, why doesn't the seagull get startled and fly away? Then finally you get close enough to see through the fog in the distance that it wasn't a seagull at all that you saw, but it was an oddly shaped piece of driftwood on the beach that from a distance and through the fog looked like a seagull. So you were wrong in thinking it was one. So Descartes knows that we can be deceived about what our senses tell us, you know, in these kinds of situations. But he goes on to say there are other beliefs that we have based on what our senses tell us that seem absolutely certain. And he says other beliefs based on the senses seem impossible to doubt. Among them are those based on what we immediately perceive, especially what we immediately perceive around us. So Descartes says, well, look, here I am. I'm sitting in my living room. He says, how can I doubt such obvious beliefs as that I'm really sitting here by the fire, that I'm in the translation says dressing gown, but Descartes' not dressing in drag. It really means like a nightshirt or his night, you know, that I'm sitting here in my night clothes. How can I doubt, says Descartes, that I'm really holding a piece of paper on which I'm writing my meditations, and that I have hands and a body that are holding the pen? You know, I mean, to bring it down to where we are, I mean, none of you doubts that there's a table up here and a briefcase sitting on it, right? And that it's too warm in this room. You know, and so Descartes says, how could I possibly raise a doubt about such obvious beliefs? Well, here's where he makes a conjecture. This is called his dream conjecture. Descartes says, but wait a second, haven't I had very vivid dreams where I thought I was sitting in my living room, and then I awoke and I found that I wasn't sitting in my living room at all. I was in bed and I was undressed. I thought I was sitting out in the living room fully dressed. So, from the fact that sometimes we may be deceived about things that we think we perceive clearly and vividly, as we are in a very vivid dream, Descartes says, well, could I be dreaming all the time? How can I disprove that this isn't a dream right now that I'll wake up from? And so he asked that question. Now, I'm going to stop there, and you can think about that. Think about how you would show somebody that you're not dreaming now, that you're really on the third floor of Grace Jacobs, being too hot sitting in philosophy class. So we're going to pick up with that. Again, the PowerPoint is visible. Now, I just did integrity recording of this, and we'll do it of the rest.